So our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has an ingenious plan to cling on to power. What's that, you might be asking? Might be faintly curious, given the catastrophic state of the Conservatives in polling, thrashed in the recent by-elections. Maybe it's to deal with the massive social crises that his party has presided over. Maybe, I don't know, properly invest in our public services, not least the National Health Service, so it's brought back from a state of collapse. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? You know, stop people dying and being trapped on waiting lists for months on end. Maybe it's to come up with something big to improve collapsing living standards. They have been squeezed for the longest period now since records began, after all. Maybe just dealing with our collapsing infrastructure, which in much of the country is what you'd expect from a much poorer country than ours is supposed to be. In short, maybe just meet people's basic fundamental needs. If that's what you're hoping for, you're going to be gutted. Instead, Rishi Sunak's great plan is to try and turn large chunks of the population against its most vulnerable citizens. Now, the front page of the Times on Saturday was Sunak aims to divide and rule after poll setback. Divide and rule. I mean, the fact this is being briefed to a friendly Conservative supporting newspaper, which has written it up kind of positively as, yeah, we're going to turn our citizens against each other in order to stay in power. That's our plan. That's the state of our politics. That is fine. So first off, this is the classic means the Tories use to retain and win power. Before the advent of democracy in this country, when only the well-off could vote and working class people were barred from doing so, it was much easier, of course, for the Conservatives to be the party of the rich, the bosses, the landlords, the vested interests. That became so much more challenging when everyone could vote. So what they did is they implemented in Britain what the British Empire had long pursued abroad, which was the politics of divide and rule. Now, this goes way back because when democracy began to be born in a very limited way in Britain, that caused panic amongst the Conservative Party. The 1831 Reform Bill was presented to Parliament. Its plan was to extend suffrage, so as many as 1 out of 5 adult males could vote, so still only about 20%. But Tories were hysterical about this. I mean, one Tory MP said, the bill represents a revolution that will overturn all the natural influence of rank and property. At least they're honest. Lord Salisbury, the future Tory Prime Minister, sulked that the expanding suffrage would mean that first-rate men will not canvass mobs and mobs will not elect first-class men. But you see, when he became Prime Minister, he was surprised to discover that up to a third of manual workers voted for the Conservative Party in the decades ahead. Now, from, that's just examples of divide and rule, what they did to help win and retain power. So from the late 19th century onwards in particular, they tapped into a growing backlash against Jewish immigration in particular, Jewish refugees, those fleeing from pogroms in the East, culminating in the introduction of the Aliens Bill in 1904. This crackdown on immigration, of course, has been a mainstay in Tory electioneering ever since. Instead of being, encouraging working class people to be angry at their conditions caused by low pay from their bosses, by the way their government runs the country in favour of the rich, they should be angry at foreigners instead and minorities. This went on for decades. Thatcher, in the election campaign in the 70s, where she won that election, she said that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. She actually called for an end to immigration altogether in that election campaign. Now, it was interesting because Cameron originally was supposed to invent himself as this cuddly liberal, going around pouncing around the Antarctic, hugging huskies and hoodies as well, back in Britain. And denouncing immigration was a mainstay of his government. He, of course, had Theresa May as Home Secretary, whose career was basically obsessed with whipping up bigotry against migrants, which is why her recent rehabilitation is rather irritating. She lied as well. She once claimed she couldn't deport an illegal immigrant because he owned a cat. Not actually true at all. The sort of demagoguery that the Conservatives have long been associated with, dishonesty and lies about migrants. Now, what we had at the time, immigration numbers were high by historical standards, and at the same time, the Conservatives demonised them as causing the problems in society that they were responsible for. Creaking public services because of austerity, blame migrants. Housing crisis because we're not building the housing we need, blame migrants. Depressed wages, not least because of crushed trade unions, blame migrants. We could go on. Now, as well as this benefit, the attack on benefit claimants on the poor is, of course, a long mainstay, or the attempt to turn working class people against poorer elements of the working class. Now, Peter Lilly was made Secretary of State for Social Security under John Major. Listen to how he entertained Tory delegates back in the early 90s.
We are not in the business of subsidising scroungers. Just like in the Mikado, I've got a little list of benefit offenders who I'll soon be rooting out and who never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's those who make up bogus claims in half a dozen names and councillors who draw the dole to run left-wing campaigns. They never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's young ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing queue, and dads who won't support the kids of the ladies they have kissed. And I haven't even mentioned all those sponging socialists. I've got them on my list, and there's none of them be missed. There's none of them be missed.
Of course, under George Osborne and David Cameron, this tradition continued. George Osborne once declared, "Where is the fairness we ask for the shift worker leaving home in the dark hours of the early morning who looks up at the closed blinds of their next door neighbour sleeping off a life and benefits?" The idea was to make low paid workers feel angry at those who were demonised as being out of work. What that meant often was disabled people, for example. So we had a war on the welfare state, which tried to say to low paid workers, don't be angry at your boss for being paid too little wages, be angry at unemployed people and disabled people who are going to demonise as being scroungers. Now, what that inevitably did is lay the foundations for an attack on many of those low-paid workers, because they were dependent often on tax credits topping up their low wages in order to live. And what happened after they went for the benefits of people who are out of work, of disabled people, they then went for tax credits topping up the wages of low-paid workers, those who were patronisingly told they were doing the right thing. Now, historically, of course, we've also had attacks on LGBTQ people. Thatcher led this crusade. Section 28. Just listen to her here.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
Honestly, she really was something else, wasn't she? Now, you can see, again, the echoes. I mean, I'll go into just the parallels of Rishi Sunak. But what she was doing there was tapping into bigotry against gay people in the 1980s. Section 28 banned the so-called promotion of homosexuality in schools. That meant in practice no education on LGBTQ issues for people like myself growing up in that period. And the idea was, in the 80s, the Tory media portrayed gay people as preying on children, as brainwashing children. That's what she was talking about there. As being sexual deviants, as being mentally ill, being a fetish, defying the laws of biology, and so on. Now, today, we see, of course, the onslaught against migrants and refugees, the Rwanda policy, deporting them en masse. The government has closed safe and legal routes for the vast majority of people around the world. One of the only ways to enter this country is via the boats, which are then portrayed by Suella Braverman as an invasion, which is how you talk about war. Rishi Sunak, his latest grotesque attack, I have to say, where he writes on Twitter, the Labour Party, a subset of lawyers, criminal gangs, they're all on the same side, propping up a system of exploitation that profits from getting people to the UK illegally. Now, whatever I think about Keir Starmer, and I have my opinions, that is despicable. Trying to portray the Labour Party as in league with criminal gangs in order to flood Britain with illegal migrants. That's you can see his aim there. It's just to descend as far into the gutter as possible in order to hold on to power. Remember when we were told that he was some sort of decent, respectable alternative to Boris Johnson? And then, of course, benefit claimants who've been impoverished and continue to be attacked. We had that in terms of the attacks on universal credit, which have continued under this government. And, of course, trans people, using that as a culture war, which is what's promised on the front page of the Times newspaper. Tragically, if you think Labour are going to fight back against these onslaughts, you're going to be gutted. They've already surrendered or capitulated on the issue of trans rights. They promised self-identification in line with other countries across Europe, which had done this for many years with no problems whatsoever. Spain is the latest to have done it. Germany are on their way to do it as well. But nonetheless, you can see what's happening here. The Tories are tapping into this long tradition, which is to try and turn people against each other, to try and often turn struggling people against other vulnerable people in order to stay in power. That is how, in the year ahead, what the Tories are going to do. Divide and rule. They're even briefing it to the Times newspaper, so you can hardly call it a conspiracy theory. We need to be aware of that. Be aware in the coming months, the weeks, months ahead, when you see these front pages. This is the strategy, this is the plan, and it has to be fought. Please like, subscribe, do support us on patreon.com/Agility4. I'll see you in a bit.